It was 7:15 a.m. when I found myself on my knees again. Not in prayer. Not in gratitude. But because I had just spilled coffee on the living room floor, the cup shattered against the tile, and the sound seemed to echo louder than it should have. I remember the silence that followed. My daughter-in-law's disapproving sigh. My son's eyes avoiding mine. No one said a word. But I could feel the judgment hanging in the air. Heavy and sharp. I reached for the towel, trembling slightly, pretending not to notice how invisible I'd become in my own child's home. As I wiped the floor, I caught sight of my reflection in the glass cabinet. A woman who no longer recognized herself. My hands, once steady and capable, now moved like they belonged to someone else. Somewhere deep inside, I wondered how I'd fallen this far. There was a time I walked into rooms where people stood to greet me. A time when my voice carried weight. When I wasn't just someone living quietly in the corners of another person's life. That morning, as I stood and placed the broken pieces in the trash, something inside me cracked too. A mix of shame and a strange, smoldering anger. I didn't know it then. But that tiny fracture was the beginning of everything changing. Because that night, the past I'd buried for almost 40 years walked through my son's front door. There was a time when my mornings smelled like freshly brewed coffee and sunlit curtains swaying in the gentle breeze. I used to hum while folding laundry, waiting for my husband to call out from the garden, asking if I'd seen his gloves again. Our days were simple, quiet, and full of the kind of peace that only comes from years of shared understanding. We'd sit on the porch after dinner, watching the light fade from the sky, holding hands even when we didn't have anything left to say. Those were the years I felt seen, safe, and loved. The years that made me believe life had finally settled into something kind. When he passed, the house grew too still. The silence that used to feel comforting became unbearable. Every creak of the floor reminded me that I was alone. I tried to stay strong, watering the plants, keeping up with the bills. But grief has a way of hollowing you out slowly, until even breathing feels like work. My son told me it wasn't good for me to live alone. He said I'd be happier closer to family, where I wouldn't have to worry about anything. And I believed him. I sold the house where I'd built my entire life, thinking I was stepping toward love and belonging again. I thought I was gaining family, but I didn't realize I was giving away freedom. I can still remember the day I packed the last box. The rooms looked strangely bare, stripped of their warmth, as if they were already forgetting me. I ran my hand along the kitchen counter one final time, tracing the faint scratches left from years of chopping vegetables and spilled laughter. Every corner of that house carried my husband's memory. The smell of his aftershave in the hallway, the dent his chair left in the carpet. I told myself that leaving was an act of courage, that starting fresh would ease the loneliness. But as the moving truck pulled away, it felt less like a beginning and more like a quiet ending. My son's house was beautiful, large, modern, spotless. Everything gleamed, but nothing felt alive. I tried to convince myself I was lucky, that I was finally surrounded by family again. The first few days, I smiled too much, offered to help too often, and thanked them for every little thing. They told me not to worry about cooking or cleaning. So I spent my mornings wandering the rooms, unsure where I belonged. My favorite old lamp stayed in its box because it didn't match the decor. My husband's photo was tucked into a drawer so the frame wouldn't clash with the theme. Bit by bit, my life was folded away. Too sentimental, too outdated, too much. Sometimes I'd catch my daughter-in-law glancing at the clock when I started talking, or my son nodding distractedly as if my words were a background sound. Meals became quieter. I learned to shrink my stories, to wait for permission to speak. Gratitude turned into silence, silence into habit. Somewhere between those perfectly arranged walls, I began to disappear. Not all at once, but piece by piece, until I barely recognized the woman unpacking her life into someone else's home. It began with the smallest things, the kinds of moments you almost feel silly noticing. A sigh when I walked into the room, a plate placed just slightly apart from the rest of the table, my laundry accidentally forgotten in the machine for days. I told myself she was just busy, that I was being sensitive. After all, I was the guest here. But as weeks passed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. There were dinners where I wasn't asked what I wanted, only handed whatever was left. Laughter that stopped when I entered the room. I could hear her voice behind closed doors. The low, clipped tone that always softened when my son came home. I tried to help, to make myself useful again. But even that became wrong somehow. If I folded the towels, they weren't folded right. If I cooked, it was too heavy or too old-fashioned. It seemed every effort I made only reminded her that I didn't belong. What hurt most wasn't her sharp words or her indifference. It was my son's silence. He'd look away when she corrected me, change the subject when I tried to explain. I could see him choosing peace over me, and it broke something quiet inside. I began moving softer, speaking less, apologizing for existing in spaces that used to feel like family. At night, I'd sit in my small room and listen to the house hum. The dishwasher, the TV, their voices faint behind walls. I realized I was living in the middle of their lives but not part of them. The woman I used to be, confident, loved, certain of her place, had dissolved into someone who measured her worth by how invisible she could be. Still, I kept pretending. I told myself kindness would win her over, that patience might soften her heart. But deep down, I knew something had shifted permanently. A quiet exile that no one spoke of but everyone felt. Then one evening, I overheard her on the phone, her voice brighter than usual. She was planning a dinner. Something about an important CEO coming to visit. She wanted everything perfect. She said, the food, the presentation, the impression. I didn't know it then. But that dinner would bring the past crashing through the walls I had tried so hard to keep standing. I woke before the sun that morning, out of habit more than necessity. Birthdays used to fill me with a kind of gentle excitement. The smell of pancakes on the griddle, laughter echoing down the hallway, wrapping small surprises in colorful paper. I used to love the way joy felt when it belonged to everyone. But that morning, the house was already alive with noise and tension. I could hear cabinet doors slamming, the faint thud of heels on the kitchen floor. It was my daughter-in-law's birthday, and she wanted everything perfect. I moved quietly, trying not to get in the way. The kitchen smelled like freshly brewed coffee and cinnamon. But underneath it was something sharper. Impatience. When I offered to make breakfast, she smiled in that way that didn't reach her eyes and said she already had it handled. A maman later? I found myself wiping counters, rearranging trays, refilling glasses. Not because she asked, but because standing still felt worse. Hours passed like that. A blur of movement. I ironed tablecloths, polished silverware, and swept the floors while she barked orders into her phone. Every so often, she'd toss a half-hearted thank you over her shoulder, as if it were a favor I should be grateful for. My son came downstairs, kissed her cheek, and called her the queen of the day. He barely noticed me. I told myself it was fine, that I didn't need attention. That helping was my gift. But when I brought out the cupcakes I'd baked, a simple vanilla recipe, just like the ones I used to make for him when he was a boy, she frowned, said they didn't fit the aesthetic. They were moved off to the side, next to the napkins. For a moment, I stood there, unsure whether to laugh or cry. I wanted to believe she didn't mean harm, that she was just stressed. But deep down, I knew I was no longer seen as family, just background noise in someone else's celebration. Later, as I passed the doorway, I heard her voice. Low, careless, cruel in its ease. She was telling a friend how exhausting it was to have someone old and needy underfoot. How I should be lucky they let me stay. The words slipped through me like glass. I stood frozen, clutching a dish towel, afraid that if I breathed too hard, the tears would come. That afternoon, I stayed quiet, moving through the house like a shadow. My hands worked, but my mind drifted. Back to the years when birthdays meant family gathering around a table, not hierarchy. I realized, with a kind of hollow clarity, that kindness had turned into my cage. I had mistaken silence for peace, endurance for grace. As the day wore on and the dinner hour approached, I forced myself to look presentable, smoothing my dress in the mirror. There was talk of an important guest arriving that evening. Someone my son wanted to impress. I didn't think much of it then. I only remember the faint tightening in my chest, a whisper I couldn't name. I had no idea that by nightfall, the life I thought I'd lost would come walking straight through that front door. The evening began like every other one where I was expected to stay invisible. The house glowed with soft, artificial warmth. Laughter floated through the air. The clinking of wine glasses, the low hum of music. The dining table was set with precision, every plate gleaming, every napkin folded perfectly. I moved between the kitchen and the dining room quietly, refilling glasses, adjusting candles, trying not to draw attention. My daughter-in-law's voice drifted through the room, sharp and polished, giving directions disguised as gratitude. She wanted perfection tonight. The night her husband would impress his important guest. I didn't even know his name until I overheard it. A simple sound. Nothing remarkable at first. But when she said it again, laughing, my hands trembled. My breath caught in my throat. And for a moment, the room spun. I told myself it couldn't be. After all these years, after everything that happened, life wouldn't be cruel enough to bring him here. Then the front door opened. The air changed. People straightened. Smiles widened. And I could hear my son greeting him with the same enthusiasm he used to greet me with as a boy. I stayed in the background, half hidden behind the archway, clutching a tray that suddenly felt too heavy. When he stepped inside, I recognized him instantly. Older, grayer, but unmistakable. The lines on his face hadn't softened him. If anything, they made him more certain of his place in the world. He shook hands, laughed easily. The kind of man everyone instinctively admired. And then his eyes found mine. For a heartbeat, time stopped. The clatter of dishes, the murmur of voices, everything blurred into a dull roar. His smile faltered. Just slightly, but enough for me to see that he knew. Recognition hit like a wave, flooding years I had tried so hard to bury. I saw the flicker of disbelief in his gaze, followed by something else. Guilt. Maybe. Or shame. I stood frozen, my hands shaking, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. In that moment, every memory I had fought to forget came rushing back. The betrayal, the loss, the night my career ended because of him. I had been so young, so certain that love and trust were the same thing. I was wrong. And now here he was, sitting at my son's table, being toasted by the very family that treated me like a burden. They called him sir, spoke his name with reverence, not knowing he was the reason my life had unraveled decades ago. The irony tasted bitter. As I moved around the table, refilling his glass, he couldn't look away. His eyes followed me, not with the arrogance of a man in power, but with the weight of someone haunted. And for the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me. The shame that had clung to me for so long began to loosen its grip, replaced by a strange, steady calm. He might have destroyed the woman I was, but he couldn't destroy the truth. When our eyes met again, I didn't look away. Neither did he. The air between us tightened, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had passed, and everything that was about to come undone. That was the moment the balance changed. He wasn't the powerful man I once feared. Not anymore. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone in the small guest room, staring at the faint reflection of my face in the darkened window. My heart wouldn't settle. Seeing him again after all these years had torn something open that I thought time had buried for good. The moment our eyes met, every wall I'd built to protect myself collapsed. The memories came rushing back. Not in order. Not gently, but like shards of glass I had to pick up one by one. I was 28 then, working as an administrative assistant in a large firm downtown. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. A chance to build something. To prove myself. I'd come from nothing. And I was determined to make something out of that hunger. He was already everything I thought I wanted to become. Confident. Respected. The kind of man who walked into a room and made people stand taller. He noticed me early on. Compliments. Small kindnesses. Moments of attention that felt like sunlight to someone who'd lived too long in the shade. I didn't fall in love quickly. But when I did, it was total. It wasn't about money or status. I truly believed in him. He spoke of dreams, of partnership, of building something together. And for a time, I believed it was real. But love built on secrecy is fragile. And one night, it shattered. His wife found out, and everything unraveled in a single day. He had everything to lose. I had only my name. And so, when the story broke, he stayed silent. My reputation was gone before I could speak a word. Rumors spread like wildfire. I was branded the ambitious woman who knew what she was doing. The kind who traded dignity for favor. I lost my job, my license, and the future I had fought for. He transferred to another branch. Quietly promoted. His record spotless. I never saw him again. Until tonight. For years. I blamed myself. I told myself I had been foolish. Reckless. Deserving of the consequences. I convinced myself that the shame was mine alone to carry. I married later. Had a family. Tried to bury that version of me beneath decades of silence. But seeing him again reminded me of a truth I had refused to face. I wasn't the only one who sinned. The difference was that my punishment lasted a lifetime. Now, as I sat in that quiet room, the sound of laughter still faintly echoing through the house, I felt something shift. I wasn't that young woman anymore. Desperate for approval. Willing to disappear to protect someone else's reputation. I had lived with the weight of that betrayal for nearly 40 years. But tonight, under that roof, surrounded by people who treated me like I was small, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Calm. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe it was clarity. But for the first time, I sensed that fate wasn't mocking me. It was circling back, giving me one final chance to reclaim what I'd lost. I didn't know yet how or when, but I could feel it. The reckoning was coming. After the dinner, the house settled into an uneasy silence. The laughter that once filled the air had vanished, replaced by something dense and unspoken. I could feel their eyes on me. My daughter-in-law's thinly veiled irritation. My son's confused glances. And beneath it all, his presence. The man I thought I'd never see again. The man who had cost me everything. I was clearing the last of the plates when he approached me quietly. His voice low. his eyes softer than I remembered. I didn't look at him at first. I couldn't. My hands were trembling as I stacked the dishes, pretending not to feel the weight of his gaze. But when he said my name, my real name, the one no one in that house ever used, something inside me stilled. It had been so long since anyone had said it with respect. He told me he'd recognized me the moment he walked in, that the years hadn't erased his guilt. He said he'd spent decades building a company, building a legacy, and that none of it made the memory of what he'd done fade. I listened in silence, unsure if I wanted his apology or his silence. But then he said something I didn't expect, that he wanted to make it right. He had a position open, one that required someone with experience, integrity, and patience. He said I was the first person he thought of. At first, I laughed. Not out loud, but inside. After all these years of trying to rebuild my dignity, it seemed almost cruel to have it handed back to me as an offer. But the more he spoke, the more I heard something in his voice that I hadn't before: humility. Not pity. Not guilt. Genuine recognition. He didn't see me as a woman broken by her past. He saw me as someone who had survived it. Before I could respond, the sharp sound of heels echoed across the floor. My daughter-in-law had been listening. Her face was pale, her eyes sharp with disbelief. My son stood behind her, silent as ever. She demanded to know what was happening. Why this man? This powerful CEO. It was speaking to me like I was his equal. It explained, calmly, that I wasn't their house guest or burden, but a woman who had once held a senior role in his firm, a woman whose career had been destroyed unjustly. The room went still. My daughter-in-law's smile cracked, and my son's face fell into something like shame. They didn't know how to look at me anymore. It was strange. After years of humiliation, I thought I'd feel triumphant watching their masks fall. But what I felt instead was peace. A deep, quiet peace. I didn't need to raise my voice or demand their apology. I simply looked at them, at the two people I had once loved so fiercely, and realized they no longer held any power over me. I told them, gently, that I wouldn't be staying any longer, that I had spent too many years apologizing for existing, and I was done. My son tried to speak, but no words came. My daughter-in-law looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I turned to the man who had once ruined my life, and saw not the person who had broken me, but the one who had unknowingly given me this moment of truth. I accepted his offer, not because I needed his job, but because I needed to choose myself. Finally, without shame. That night, I packed quietly. No tears. No anger. Just calm. I left the house before dawn, the air cool and sharp against my face. The street was empty, the world still. For the first time in decades, I felt light, as if every weight I had carried had finally slipped from my shoulders. As I walked toward the car waiting for me, I didn't look back. The horizon was pale with the first hint of morning. I realized then that freedom doesn't always come with noise or victory. Sometimes, it comes in silence. In the simple act of walking away, knowing that your story isn't over yet. The first morning in my new apartment was quiet in a way I hadn't felt in years. No footsteps rushing past my door. No whispered judgments behind thin walls. Just the soft hum of the city below, and the faint warmth of sunlight slipping through the curtains. When I think about everything that's happened, the humiliation, the silence, the nights I spent wondering if I'd ever feel whole again, it no longer feels like a tragedy. It feels like a long, hard lesson in learning who I really am. I used to measure my worth by what others thought of me, by the love I gave and the approval I craved. But now, I see that dignity isn't something anyone can grant or take away. It's something you quietly decide to keep. no matter how deeply life tries to break you. I'm grateful, not for the pain itself, but for what it revealed. It showed me that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's freedom. That courage isn't always loud or defiant. Sometimes it's just the strength to keep going. To stand up from the floor one more time. To believe that peace is still possible. If I could tell the woman I was back then one thing, it would be this: you don't have to be unbroken to be whole. Every scar, every disappointment, every loss, they don't erase your worth. They refine it. And now, as I close this chapter, I hope my story reminds someone out there that it's never too late to begin again. Maybe you've been silenced, overlooked, or hurt beyond words. But you're still here. That means your story isn't over. If this spoke to you, share it. Leave a comment. Tell me what strength looks like in your life, or what you're still fighting to find. Because sometimes, sharing our stories isn't just how we heal. It's how we help others start healing too.